And now I want to ask Susan Hornsby-Geluk to come forward. She's going to speak about a professional advisor's view of dealing with government. She is one of New Zealand's leading employment lawyers in a number of international directories. She's got 18 years of experience in advising government employers, but also private sector employers, and most importantly, she is my law partner at Chempama. Suze.
Thanks, Mai. This is really interesting. It's all about silos, and I've heard everybody who's come up today actually use that word because I act for a broad range of public sector organisations, and tell you what amazes me is how little information sharing there is across those organisations and how little discussion about strategy. So in the employment law area, which is my space, there doesn't appear to be a coordinated public sector employment relations strategy. So I see this particularly in the collective bargaining space, where every organisation has a different strategy, they've got a different view about remuneration, they've got a different view about how they interact with unions, and all of this leads to totally different outcomes. Restructuring is another area. If you look at restructuring, all of these public sector organisations have a different approach. They've got different contractual arrangements. Some of you will recall the public sector restructuring pool that they set up a couple of years back. And you'll remember the purpose of that was where public sector employees were made redundant. They could go into the pool, they could get picked up by other public sector agencies. What a great idea. But did it work? No. Why didn't it work? Because there was a lack of coordination centrally, and I think actually a lack of engagement from public sector organisations. So why the silos? Why the fragmentation? Firstly, the fact that many public sector employers are only engaged for 5-year fixed terms does make it hard for long-term planning. Secondly, of course, every time the government changes, or even when there's a cabinet reshuffle, the whole way in which public sector organisations have to interact with government changes, the focus changes, the priorities change, so what you get is inward-looking rather than outward-looking options, and also a short-term rather than a long-term view. I'd also like to say there's a unique set of challenges that face public sector employers. You've got public sector employers on the one hand expected to develop their own employment relations strategies, their own remuneration strategies, but they don't actually control all of the levers to enable them to do that. They don't control the funding necessarily, and they don't necessarily have independent decision making around restructuring. So look at what's happened in pay negotiations over the last 3 or 4 years. You've had public sector agencies who've been told by government, look, there's no money in the pot, there will be no increases across the board this year, you'll have to go to the bargaining table and see what you can do. So of course these organisations have gone to the bargaining table for the last 3 years and have said to the unions, there is no money for pay increases, and of course the unions say, well, that's not good enough. We expect government employers to stay up to date with cost of living increases, and actually this is a government priority issue, not an issue for the employer. But nonetheless the employer is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and what that has led to, in my view and in my experience, is protracted bargaining outcomes. At a strategic level, you also see that public sector employers have very different approaches to remuneration, and this is the issue as to whether employees should be paid based on service. In other words, every year you turn up, you get an across-the-board living increase, or should they be paid based on their performance? Now that is a fundamental question, but is there a uniformity of approach across the public sector on this fundamental question? Absolutely not. Every public sector agency takes a different approach to that issue, and there's no central agency setting the agenda in terms of what those public employers are supposed to be doing. And now contrast this to the PSA, and we've heard from Helen Kelly today, they've got a very systematic and strategic approach to employment relations across the sector. And in fact, in last year's collective bargaining round, I understand that they had the equivalent of a war room where every public sector agency was listed up on a sheet of paper around the room and their bargaining status updated on a daily basis. Like, this is organised, it's strategic, and that's where the strategic and centralised focus comes from. Now, by contrast, public sector employers approach this on a ad hoc basis based on what the particular chief executive may think at the time. And whilst you've got SSC who provides some level of overview, there is a significant gap, I think, in terms of the level of guidance and the strategy which has been input into the sector. Another area where public sector employers face particular challenges is in juggling the political and the public relations aspects. So just to take a very simple example, look at settling personal grievances. Now, all public sector chief executives will tell you that our prime responsibility is to safeguard taxpayer money. Well, of course it is, but the interpretation as to how they do that is very different. So in settling personal grievances, some employers will take the view that they'll settle everything because we're not going to waste taxpayer money by throwing it at litigation. And in some cases, even where the personal grievances are quite unmeritorious. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got other employers who will say, well, even in a case where the employer is arguably wrong, we must litigate this because we're not going to throw taxpayer money at settling grievances. Now, I'm not here telling you which option is right. I'm simply identifying that there are a vast range of views, and I think some confusion in terms of principled decision making because of the range of considerations that public sector employers need to take into account. So finally, what do we do about it? Where should this guidance come from? Of course, SSC already play an important role, and that's in terms of making sure public sector agencies meet government objectives. And we've seen a greater all-of-government focus from SSC recently, but there's still a gap, and I think that there needs to be somebody filling that gap because you've got coordination on the union side, but a lack of a central strategy. So really my message is that some agency, whether it's SSC or somebody else, needs to pick up the slack and needs to set, I think, a clear strategy for public sector employers.